Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be taking a look at how to achieve revenue growth from resource efficiency. My name is Stephen Kennett and I look after the supply chain and waste working channels here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome our presenters today. We have Dr Greg Lavery, CEO of Lavery Pennell and lead author of the Next Manufacturing Revolution study. We're also very fortunate to be joined by Tracey Rawling-Church, Head of CSR at Kyocera Document Solutions in the UK. Today's presentations will last around 30 to 35 minutes, which will leave us with 10 to 15 minutes at the end. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Just type in your question and press send, and then we'll wait until the end before answering as many as we can. As an aside, if you should have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Greg, who'll get started with today's. So over to you, Greg.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We're really excited about this because this is number 2 in a series of 7 Next Manufacturing Revolution topics. Now, let me introduce that a little bit more. So in November, we gave a webinar which is safely archived in the 2 Degrees system, so you can retrieve it on remanufacturing with Caterpillar, gave a really good presentation as part of that as well. We have further webinars to come on energy efficiency, waste reduction, packaging reduction, transport efficiency and supply chain collaboration through this year. To introduce the Next Manufacturing Revolution, it's a sort of not-for-profit get-together between ourselves, Lavery Pennell, the University of Cambridge's Institute for Manufacturing and 2 Degrees. We published a report last year and are really delighted to be transmitting or giving a series of these 7 webinars that explain the individual sort of chapters and areas of study. The main focus was around non-labour resource productivity, or let's call it non-labour resource efficiency. What we realised is that there's such a massive opportunity there that this really is tantamount to a manufacturing revolution and therefore hence the name. So moving on, a little bit about who we are. We are strategy advisors or consultants, is the unfashionable term, assisting clients to substantially increase profit while becoming more sustainable. We do that in a variety of ways using corporate strategy, engineering and sustainability experience, and we co-authored the Next Manufacturing Revolution. Enough about us. So let's talk about revenue growth through resource efficiency. Now, most companies think about resource efficiency as something that is done in the plant by an engineering or a facility manager because it consists of things like energy efficiency and waste and deeply unfashionable subjects. And apologies if people have that as their main job description, but it's very difficult to have those topics, as you know, attract reasonable funding. What we found, though, is that if you look at what some of the best practice companies are doing around the world in their resource efficiency, they're turning it to their advantage around not just reducing cost base, but also finding profitable revenue growth opportunities within the organisation. And as you'd all know, that revenue growth, new shiny products are really what capture the attention of boards and chief executives. And so wrapping up a revenue growth story as part of an overall resource efficiency initiative can actually boost the economics and returns as well as executive interest in the subject of non-labour resource efficiency. There are 4 business models that I'm going to talk to you about in terms of revenue growth from resource efficiency, and those are more efficient products, lower footprint products, servitization or servitization. Servitization is the term that the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge are using, so I'm going to defer to their greater wisdom. And then finally, the reuse and sharing of products. So really, I'm just going to step very quickly through each of those 4, and then delighted that Tracy's able to join us because she can give a really tangible example of a company that's succeeding very well in its markets by doing a number of these different models. So the first of these is more efficient products. So what this is all about is saying, let's make a product use less resources in its use phase. That's not while it's being manufactured. We'll get to that in a moment. But the first opportunity is saying, if we're going to make a light bulb or an engine or a motor, let's make it a lot more efficient for the customer, with the simple value proposition that over the lifetime of whatever the product is that you make, that will save them energy and therefore save them money. And on a life cycle based cost, the economics looks pretty attractive, which means that you can charge more for those products because you're effectively sharing a little bit of that upside with the customer. For manufacturers, it's an opportunity to grow market share and profits from this additional value. And a couple of examples there, and I'm sure you can think of lots of things from laundry detergents that wash in cold water and therefore save not only the environment from greenhouse gas emissions, but also save the householder from the energy bills it takes to heat up that water. There's been a lot of work going on, but wanted to call this out as the first example of the model. The second example is around lower footprint products, and I've got a photo there of the iconic British grown strawberries, which are an example of a product that has a lower footprint embodied in it because they're grown in the UK. Now, you can argue, yes, there's all sorts of greenhouse issues because you need to heat the greenhouses and provide CO2 and a whole bunch of other issues around that, but fundamentally growing some produce in the UK reduces its transport footprint and as well provides local jobs as well. And that means a proposition for the customer that says, look, at roughly the same price, you're getting a product that's better for the planet and the local economy. For manufacturers, it means greater market share as customers choose more sustainable products at the same price point. Now, I'm not going to delude anyone by saying that you can actually get a massive price premium from a lower footprint product. I think for most companies, there's been a recognition that a greener product actually will be chosen at the same price point ahead of less green products. Price premia, though, are a little more difficult to justify, although our work with Interface Carpets and others is actually showing that there is a price point advantage there and a genuine premium that you can charge. That's a little controversial in mainstream sustainability discussion, so I'll just leave that as it is. But let it be known that there is some research emerging that demonstrates that. And of course, for the manufacturer, it also means that you can reduce your production and distribution costs if you're not having to pump as much fertilizer, energy, etc., into your products or transport them quite as far. So that's the second model I wanted to briefly discuss. The third one is around servitization that says, let's sell a product, sell a service instead of a product. And a classic example of this is what a number of paint manufacturers have done, as they've said, why is it that when you go into a car spray booth, there's all sorts of not only environmental hazards involved in that, but also there's so much paint wasted. Now, in the old days, if you were a chemical company, you were quite happy to sell as much paint as a car manufacturer could waste because at the end of the day, you got paid per litre. The new, more responsible model that is emerging, that more and more paint manufacturers are offering, is to say to the car manufacturers, we'll provide you with square metres of painted surface area on your cars. And they're moving to a powder-coated finish with a infrared curing system, which means that actually the amount of substance use is a whole lot less. So they're able to be a lot more efficient and take control over the parameters and process involved in creating that coating service. So classic example there. The customer value proposition says it's lower cost because the manufacturer designs and maintains the product for maximum output, or in the case of paint, manages the application process and improves that design. There is also reduced waste to manage. And waste is not just a problem because it occurs and therefore you're wasting money on materials, but also, especially in the case of paint, there's a lot of health and safety risk around that as well. Not to mention time it takes to dry paint. For the manufacturer, you get greater customer loyalty in the case of paint because you've locked in a customer to the equipment and processes that you're offering. It means recurring service revenues because the managing that process can generate those revenues. And at the end of the day, for some products, it can lead to end-of-use product recapture for reuse, recycling, and remanufacture if you own that product through its entire life. And Tracy's got some great examples of that. That's the third one. The fourth one then that I wanted to share was the reuse and sharing of products. Classic example here is Zipcar. This is all about a product that's used only when people use it, but otherwise it's therefore commonly available. The customer value proposition is a pretty simple one, and if we think in the Zipcar example, it means that we all don't need to own a car, maintain that car, insure the car, store it, and we only pay for when we use it. For the manufacturer, and let's face it, many car companies are now only starting to think about the shared ownership model and what it means for their future. They're able to trial new products, they get their brand exposed to many more customers, and they have the opportunity to attract higher revenues if they continue to own the product, because they're wrapping in a whole lot of convenience that means potentially they can offer a higher price. Sorry, they can charge a higher price per unit than they would have if they were just selling a car. So there's the four examples. Now, let me give you some proof that some of this exists. We talked before a little bit about, well, the revenue growth is being captured by a number of companies through resource efficiency. And so what we've looked at here is a range of companies on this slide. And you can see they're all pretty household names. What we looked at is their resource efficient products, which we've called sort of green products. And we've said, okay, how fast has their overall company revenues grown? And then if we took out those products that are resource efficient, how fast has the rest of the portfolio grown? And there on the y-axis, we've actually plotted the difference between the total portfolio and the non-green portfolio, or the non-resource efficient product portfolio. And you can see that there's a range of about 1 to 2% growth rate premium on that. And that's the amount of growth above what they would have achieved if they just had their non-resource efficient product. And that's really amazing, really, because that means that even if you don't have a large proportion of your portfolio there that are more resource efficient products, such as Dow or DuPont with about 5%, you're still getting a 1 to 2% premium, roughly the same premium as Siemens is getting, with a 43% of their product portfolio being more resource efficient. Now, there are outperformers in there. Clearly, Philips and Procter & Gamble are doing very well. But the message is that even a conservative viewpoint that says let's discount those overachievers, we've still got a demonstrated premium there that can be achieved. So this is the sort of fact base for the business case that says, yes, there is that opportunity there for revenue growth through more resource efficient products. Let's have a look here quickly at what servitization's done in a number of industries. So if we look on the left-hand side, chemicals management services, which says chemicals companies don't just sell chemicals and then wash their hands of what those chemicals, where those chemicals go post that, but they actually take them back, reprocess those, and look after that as more of a service than just selling chemicals. And you can see that there's been quite good growth since 2000 up to 2009 at 20% per annum. That's quite fast growth. And an even more astonishing growth rate is if you look at Rolls-Royce's Total Care product, which says they don't just want to sell engines, they want to sell a whole ongoing lifetime management maintenance of those engines. You can see there in the grey cloud that Total Care is now used on 90% of new civil large engine aircraft. So there's a massive growth there that is quite extraordinary. The key message there is if servitization can apply to your sector, then there is a wave potentially of change coming, and being ahead of that means that you can surf that wave compared with having to react to it from the first mover at a disadvantage. Now let's be realistic about this as well. Not all product types actually fit all of these four types of new opportunity models. And we've very quickly sort of sketched out here on a sector by sector for the manufacturing sectors in the UK where these various models apply, and I encourage you to have a think about where you fit in that and what the opportunities might be available to you. And then finally, if you'd like to read more about the opportunities around revenue growth from resource efficiency, there's a whole chapter on that on the 160-page Next Manufacturing Revolution report, which is available at our website, and also on 2 Degrees, that's been mounted up there. Of course, welcome discussion about any of this, and if you'd like to email me, there's my email. So I hope that's helpful. So, Stephen, if you could pass over control now to Tracy, I'd love to introduce Tracy and hear her thoughts and see what she's done at Kyocera to actually implement this.
Hi, Greg. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. So I'm Tracey Rawling-Church. I'm Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at Kyocera Document Solutions UK Limited. We're the UK subsidiary of a Japanese-owned multinational which operates a number of diverse businesses, but I'm from the Office Products Division, which basically manufactures and sells printers and copiers. But the way that we're doing that has changed quite significantly over the last 20 years. And I think I've got some strong examples for you of how we've used a focus on resource efficiency to drive our revenue growth, create competitive advantage, and enhance our profitability. So moving straight on, I'll explain to you first of all how the resource-efficient products has transformed our business. So this is a familiar object seen from an unusual angle. You've almost certainly got one of these on your desk. It's a conventional printer cartridge. So all laser printers have one of these in as their consumable. It's by definition a very resource inefficient object. So a conventional printer cartridge contains over 70 components. There are numerous different metals, plastics, foams, etc. in it. Many of them in very small quantities. Very difficult to disassemble, very difficult to recycle. And actually what this design means is that every time you run out of toner, you replace pretty much every working part in your printer. So it's analogous to replacing the engine of your car every time it runs out of fuel. And as you can imagine, when you're replacing these multiple times throughout the product's life, you're consuming a massive amount of resources to kind of mine the materials, manufacture, distribute the cartridges, and then dispose of them at the end of life. And all those resources come at a price that has to be paid repeatedly during the life of the product. So Kyocera's expertise in ceramics gave us a solution to that, and a way of fixing what we saw at the time as the biggest issue, which is that most of these cartridges end up in landfill. About 47 million a year just in the UK. To visualise that, it would cover 17 football pitches. And that's because they are very difficult to recycle. It's not really cost effective to dismantle them. And although there's a whole industry that's grown up around refilling them with toner, it's only a partial solution because it can't be done indefinitely. And so inevitably, eventually, the cartridge will reach the end of its useful life and something needs to be done with it. So Kyocera saw an opportunity to use its expertise in industrial ceramics to design a print drum that was durable enough to remain inside the printer for its entire life as a service part, rather than replacing it regularly as part of the consumable. And that single innovation enabled other long-life components to be designed in as permanent parts too. And so the outcome was, in 1992, so it's more than 20 years ago now, Kyocera brought to market the first cartridge-free laser printer. And so instead of having the drum and developer unit as part of a consumable cartridge, which had a typical life of around 5,000 pages at the time, Kyocera's long-life drum was instead designed to last the entire design life of the printer, which at the time was 300,000 pages. And since then, we've managed to increase our drum life to as much as 1 million pages in heavy-duty machines. So the idea being that the fewer components you have in your consumable, the less resources you use throughout the life of the product. So that's what a Kyocera consumable looks like if you take it to pieces. It's basically a plastic cassette full of toner powder with a few cogs and wheels and things necessary to actually fix it into the machine so that it can interact with the rest of the components. And it's clear to see from the pictures that that resource-efficient approach drastically reduces the amount of waste that's produced during the printer's life, and also the life cycle impact of the consumables. But there are some numbers there on the slide that quantify those improvements too. But actually, more importantly, from the customer's point of view, it also reduced the running costs. Bear in mind that this technology was launched in 1992. At that time, there really wasn't a great deal of focus on sustainability in the majority of businesses, and nobody was going to buy an office printer purely on the basis of its green credentials. So we needed to make sure that there was actually a tangible customer benefit that really mattered to the customers that we needed to buy our products. And with consumables contributing typically 80% of the lifetime cost of owning a printer, that resource-efficient approach actually fulfilled that aim of delivering a significant customer benefit. So even for customers who didn't select their printers on the basis of their environmental impact, there was an important competitive differentiation built in. So the thing that we became aware of very early on, bearing in mind that when we introduced this product, it was kind of the early days of things like environmentally friendly detergents that cost about 4 times as much as conventional ones. But actually, design for resource efficiency overturns that misconception that environmentally preferable products are more expensive for the customer. But it's important to take a whole life costing approach to evaluating them, because often the product that's cheapest to buy can cost more to run, either in direct costs, in our case with consumables, or in indirect costs, things like energy and waste disposal costs. So generally speaking, over its lifetime, any product which uses fewer resources will be less expensive, as well as reducing environmental impact. And that's why product design is so critical, because those lifetime impacts, the majority of them are determined at the design stage. But you need substantial and ongoing investment in R&D to support continuous improvement in resource efficiency. And it's really hard to sustain that if you're forced to compete on hardware price. So that's been a challenge, really, to make sure that we could deliver something which was cost competitive while still retaining the ability to invest in ongoing R&D. So that's about the resource efficiency of the product during its life, which I think was Greg's first point. Moving on from that, the cartridge-free concept is our most disruptive innovation in product design, but we've continued to make incremental improvements in other areas of the product too. And we make continued refinements in product design using life cycle analysis to quantify the impact at every stage of the life cycle. So every new product that's introduced, the idea is that at every stage in its life cycle, it should have less impact than the product that it replaces in our portfolio. And in terms of our division, going back to Greg's graph, 100% of our products are resource efficient. So this isn't part of our portfolio. Our entire portfolio is based on this premise. So sometimes the improvements might be in reducing materials or manufacturing costs, or contributing to our organisational emissions by being more carbon efficient to manufacture, for example. But sometimes it might be something that's experienced by the customer during the use phase, sometimes a combination of both. So we're looking across the whole life cycle constantly to try and ensure that the products are always evolving to become more and more efficient. But even with Kyocera's resource efficient design, there's a challenge in that the biggest spike in the life cycle is the use phase, which in fact contributes far more emissions, probably twice as many emissions as all the other life cycle stages combined. Power consumption is the biggest of all, and that's often the case in an energy-using product. And consumables, even with our resource-efficient consumables technology, is still the second biggest impact, again, across the whole life cycle. So the challenge for us is that both of those impacts occur in the use phase, which is where the customer's in control of the product, not us. So the idea is that we should support the customer to buy, use, and dispose of our products more efficiently. And the most effective way to do that is by thinking about the performance rather than the product. Because actually, when a customer buys a printer, doesn't necessarily need a printer. What he needs is to share information. So by focusing on the most efficient way of delivering that performance, we've been able to adapt our business model to tackle those use phase impacts. And I have to say that we're fortunate in that ours is an industry where that product to service shift is well advanced, and there's relatively little resistance because of some of the things that were already inherent in the market. For example, customers were already used to the idea that they would lease copiers rather than buy them. So some of the barriers that exist in other industries didn't exist for ours. But I think it's also important that we're able to build in the measurement of the improvements into the service. And I'll explain a little bit about how that happens. So this I could easily talk about for the entire 15 minutes. This is the anatomy of a managed document service. So this is the imaging industry's example of the product to service shift. And the basic concept is to supply the minimum number of printers and copiers needed to support the efficient management of information, and then to support that with professional services and software that reduce reliance on hard copy and continuously optimize the system. And then you put that in a charging model, which includes a consumption-based element. So by charging for every page printed or copied, there's a built-in incentive for the customer to use the equipment less, because the less they use it, the less they pay. So what we always see is that customers who move to a managed document service use less energy, less paper, and fewer consumables. And consequently, their costs inevitably go down. And while the total cost of the service is provably less than the cost of owning and operating the fleet of devices that the customer would have previously had, the supplier more than makes up for the lost hardware revenue by developing new revenue streams from all the other services seen around the wheel. So the importance of hardware in the customer relationship diminishes, and the importance of services is increasing pretty much exponentially. So what's really elegant about that is that the service begins with an audit of the customer's actual activity and analyses the cost and environmental impacts, and then models the improvements that can be achieved by the specified solution that's designed for the customer. And then the software that controls the service monitors and reports on the achievement against the project's objectives and provides management intelligence that can be used to optimize the system on a continuous basis to make sure that it continues to deliver on its goals over the long term. So the ability to measure the improvement is actually built into the service, and right from the very beginning in terms of understanding what the customer has and what they want to achieve. And that makes it really easy to demonstrate what's being achieved. And you can see some live figures here. This is from an actual customer site in the insurance industry. Insurance is quite a paper-heavy industry because often the proof of the product that's been sold to the customer is a piece of paper, an insurance certificate. So it's harder than most industries to design paper out of the workflows. But even there, they've managed to achieve a 21% reduction in paper consumption, and you can see fairly massive reductions in other costs. But the other key benefit was that the actual downtime of the machines in the fleet was massively reduced. And this is one of the key factors in providing an efficient service-led offering, in that rather than building your solution around specifications of equipment, you build it around service levels. So it actually doesn't matter which hardware you provide to the customer. It doesn't even matter whether that hardware is new, as long as it achieves the KPIs that have been agreed in the contract. So it enables you to deploy the hardware very efficiently, in that you don't necessarily always have to be installing new equipment. You can sometimes run with the equipment a customer already had. You can move it from one customer site to another if it's more appropriate there, as long as you're hitting those KPIs that are in the customer agreement. Then it should satisfy the terms of the contract. Now, I should emphasise that this business model isn't unique to Kyocera, but the resource-efficient technology that I showed you earlier means that we really do optimise the resource efficiency of not just the service, but also the equipment that provides it. And another key benefit of a managed document service is that because the equipment's typically leased, title to the hardware is retained by the supplier, who can then determine what happens to it at the end of the contract. One of the other attributes of Kyocera's products is that they're designed for easy disassembly. So the majority of plastic parts clip together. They're all embossed with the material code. Where metal fixings are used, they can all be undone with a single crosshead screwdriver. So theoretically, it's possible to separate different materials before reprocessing, making it possible to derive virgin quality recyclate from end-of-life machines, which is great, except that the default process used by UK recyclers are geared around the requirements of the WEEE legislation, which has volume-based targets. So the default solution is simply to shred everything and use magnets to pick out the metals from the residue, which means that the different plastics and metals get commingled and contaminated, which degrades the quality and the value of the recycled material. So it's actually very difficult currently to get as virgin materials out of the UK e-waste stream. So we've been working recently with industrial designers to understand how the quality and the value of recyclate could be improved by diverting equipment that's designed for disassembly, not just ours, but other products from other market sectors. If we could divert that equipment that's designed for disassembly through alternative processes, then it should be possible to provide better quality recyclate for incorporation into other industrial processes. And at the same time as that, we're also working with our channel partners to see how we can better support them in some of the really good stuff they do already. Many of them already refurbish end-of-contract equipment and resell it to other customers. Some of them are recycling equipment from one contract into another as part of a managed service. Many of them are using spare parts from equipment which has either reached the end of its contract or where other components have failed, rather than using virgin parts. And those processes are a bit, at the moment, not very professional, not very slick, and there's not a lot of opportunity for channel partners to share with other channel partners if one has a part that the other needs, for example. So we're looking at things that we could do to facilitate some of that sharing of parts within our channel. So reflecting back at Greg's 4 opportunities then, we're exploring all of those to some extent at Kyocera, and actually each of them is supporting revenue growth and profitability. So by designing our products to use fewer resources through their life cycle, we're improving their cost of ownership, which brings tangible customer benefits that allow us to differentiate ourselves, but also reduce the need for us to discount the hardware so deeply. Designing products to use fewer resources in manufacture clearly reduces our manufacturing costs, and also, we're driving down energy costs and using renewables in our factories and all those other good things as well. What's been really transformational is the performance-based business models. The migration from a kind of hardware-centric to a service-centric business has been massively beneficial for us, and we're creating really profitable new revenue streams in things like professional services, which 5 years ago weren't even part of our business. And then finally, the thing that we're least advanced on, I would say, is increasing the value that we can recover from end-of-life equipment or end-of-first-life equipment. Currently, WEEE compliance is a cost for us, but we believe that by being a bit more cunning about the way that we take advantage of the design of our products for disassembly, we may be able to turn that cost into a revenue opportunity through the resale of virgin quality materials. So what does that all mean for Kyocera? Well, as I've just mentioned, it's really required us to fundamentally rethink the way our business is organised to make that shift from a hardware-led to a service-led business. And to do that, we've invested in creating a national network of service engineers. We've established a new professional services division, and to make sure that that professional services division is absolutely top class. We're investing in things like ITIL and providing Prince 2 training for all our professional services personnel, and that's required significant investment. But the return on that investment is really remarkable. Our market is mature. The market for printer and copier hardware is stagnant. There's really no growth there in terms of the number of devices. And prices and margins are both under severe pressure as a result of that. But over the last 3 financial years, Kyocera Document Solutions UK has more than doubled its revenue. And we've managed to self-fund all that investment in creating those new divisions and business units whilst remaining profitable. But I would say, just harking back to something Greg mentioned about market share, in terms of our total revenue delivered as a business, then I'm pretty sure our market share has increased. But if you look at the market share stats that are presented for our industry, it hasn't. And that's because market share for our industry is still measured according to the hardware that's shipped. And so all that revenue created through professional services is kind of hidden and under the radar. And so while we're transforming our businesses, I think we also need to transform some of the ways that we measure the relative success of the businesses in our industry. So that's the end of my little canter through Kyocera's application of resource efficiency to drive revenue growth. And I hope that you found it useful. I gather I'm now handing back to Stephen, who's going to host the question.
Great, thank you very much, Tracy. And I'll bring Greg back in now as well. Just to remind everyone that you can keep sending your questions in now. So we've got a good 10 to 15 minutes to go through everything. So I think maybe a good question to begin with, maybe Greg, if you want to pick up with this firstly, is how do you go about communicating what you've done to customers? Do you have any sort of tips or
Yeah, good question. And this is why these sorts of new business models, as Tracy described, require a sort of company-wide approach, because your customer-facing part of your organisation is going to be the sales team. So what we always advise is let's start with the sales guys and the marketing team behind them, and give the sales guys a value proposition that they can use with customers. So instead of saying, we will sell you this box, we will sell you the use of this box, which will save you some money compared with our competitors. And we'll also maintain that box, etc., etc. So what we always advise, in order to start this journey, start with something simple. And you don't, as you know, in communicating between a sales team and a customer, you can't get too complex with too much information. That's why it's best to sort of move this journey slowly, starting with one simple thing to get going. So advice there is start with the sales guys and the marketing material behind them in order to start communicating that better opportunity for customers.
Great. Tracy, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yes, I would agree with Greg. You need to make sure that you have a compelling customer proposition. And that's really about, distilling what this actually means to the customer. And going back to the point I made about when a customer buys a printer, they don't necessarily need a printer. What they need is to exchange information. And by really distilling down the customer need, you can sometimes create an opportunity to sell performance rather than a product that may not have occurred to you previously. But then you need to make that something. The problem with services is they're intangible. So you need to be able to present that to a customer in a way that they can readily understand the benefits to their business. And not all customers are geared up to buy a service rather than a product. It's actually not necessarily an easy transition to make for the customer either. And that's what we found in a piece of research that we did with Forum for the Future. The customers need to adapt as well as the suppliers.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Another question, and I'm not sure if you're in a position to answer this, but maybe you can sort of give us your thoughts on it. But what was the appetite like within the company when they first started taking this approach? Was there any sort of reluctance to go along these lines?
I don't think there was. I think it was easier for us than it's been in other industries. And I know there have been, there are examples of other industries where attempts have been made to move from a product-led to a service-led offering, and it hasn't been so successful. And I think we were fortunate in that many of the components of a service-ized approach were already there. And so for us, it was more a question of joining them up and making them something a bit more cohesive. And so I think that made it easier, to be perfectly honest. I also think that because Kyocera is a values-led business, there's a kind of fairly deep and sincere commitment to being sustainable throughout every aspect of the business. So we didn't have to have that fight before we could make a start. And I think that also made it.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Greg, have you got any thoughts around that, and maybe also about how to engage senior managers within the business around these ideas?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So the basic message that we have is it's all about the business case. And often companies have a burning platform in that their normal business is really struggling to compete with, for example, low-cost product produced in developing nations. So that's one way to get that business case up. The other one that we often help companies with is actually just saying, well, what's this really worth? Let's quantify what all the revenue growth opportunities are, as well as obviously the internal cost savings from reduced resource use. Because nothing gets senior executives more excited than making a whole lot more money on the profit, because ultimately that's what they're accountable for.
Thanks, Greg. Another question here is accepting resource efficiency possibilities. People would be interested in your views on how to manage the rebound effect often experienced in the consumer electronics field. So smaller, lower energy products, yet the consumer is driven to buy and use more. Greg, do you maybe want to begin?
Yeah, let me have a first go. A really good question. I mean, the rebound effect has been proven to be real. I mean, the problem is you can't say to a customer, look, we've saved you some energy on this. For goodness sake, don't then go and take a holiday to the south of Spain because you can now afford to do that, because that's trying to dictate a lifestyle. And you don't go and buy more appliances or consumer electronics, because that's very difficult for a company to do. What I would say, though, is that beyond that, so first of all, trying to be heavily moralistic with customers, it has been proven not to go down very well. I mean, that's why the whole environmental movement got a pretty bad name, and the whole Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is always struggling to be seen as credible, despite the fact that it's got some of the world's best scientists in it. What's countering that, though, is a convergence of consumer electronics as well. So let's think about an iPhone. In the old days, you had cameras, MP3 players, and before that CD players, and a whole bunch of other devices that now your iPhone does for you all in one. And apps are obviously increasing that. Oh, let's say GPS systems as well. So there is a lot of convergence going on as consumer electronics companies get smarter. So I'm hopeful that over time that will resolve itself as we all have fewer and fewer products that do more and more. Other than that, I don't think I can offer any more useful insights, although Tracy can probably talk about the convergence within the photocopier industry, where scanning, copying, faxing, etc. is now pretty standard on one machine.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this is a question which is more easily tackled in a B2B environment, and we are B2B specialists, so that's clearly what I know best. And the fact that you're now able to have a single device that does the thing that 3 or 4 other devices would do separately, it's very easy to make the business case for saying, why don't you have one of these multifunctional devices in your office instead of the 3 or 4 separate ones, all consuming energy separately, all consuming different consumables. So it's an easier argument to have in a business environment. And I do think, as far as consumer products are concerned, there is a responsibility on the part of suppliers to try and influence customer behaviour. I mean, I've just seen a second question pop up from Janet, who has a very, very good point that, and the typical mobile phone contract, you're offered an upgrade every year, and that drives consumer behaviour, consumer expectation, where people want a new phone every year. So, if we change those contracts, then we don't prompt the replacement of a device which is probably working perfectly well, and the customer wouldn't have thought about replacing if they weren't prompted to do so. So I think we've got to take responsibility for that in industry. And, you can't be preachy about it. People are not motivated by being beaten up about their consumption. But you can be a bit more subtle about it and still change behaviour. And if you can make it financially appealing not to replace your phone, then that's clearly a better solution.
And can I add to that, especially around the question, Janet's question around replacing iPhones, and an earlier question as well asked by someone else about sort of what are other examples of servitization. What Vodafone's doing is very interesting right now. It's saying instead of giving you a phone that you own and then you can throw away when you're sick of it and get another one, Vodafone's saying we'll give you a phone and a plan, and we'll charge you for the use of the phone, but not for the handset itself. So what that means is Vodafone continues ownership of the handset, so they can take that back at the end of its first life, redeploy it, reuse it, remanufacture it, refurbish it, whatever that appropriate response is to capture those resources at the highest value at the end of its first life, which is a really interesting model. So for those of you who are sort of looking for a better solution around mobile phones, go and have a chat with Vodafone and see if you can take out one of those contracts, because I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you. And those sorts of models are emerging elsewhere. Philips, for example, is now experimenting with the idea of selling just light, as in lit surfaces instead of selling light bulbs. And hospitals for a long time have been able to buy heat, steam and hot water rather than boiler units, because the whole energy services company or energy performance contracting model has been around for a couple of decades now, where servitization is actually a very real option for them, because there are organisations that are prepared to own and maintain the equipment that provide all of those services.
Great, thank you, Greg. So we've got a two-parter question now, and to start with, how do you choose which products to tackle first and prioritise, and then how do you assess the environmental impact at the design stage? What tools are you using to do that? Tracy, do you maybe want to kick off with that one?
Yeah, Kyocera has a kind of well-established life cycle analysis methodology that it applies at the design stage of every single product. And so that's looking across all the impacts, not just carbon impacts, but all the raw materials impacts, the waste impacts, the manufacturing resources, etc. And so by using that same consistent methodology for every product, you have a basis for comparison that's nice and consistent and robust. And I guess actually it doesn't, as long as you are consistent, as long as you adopt a fairly robust methodology and you're consistent about applying it, you should be able to make those judgments, because for every product you'll be able to come out with a number or a series of numbers that says this is its life cycle impact, compared with either this other product from your portfolio or the product it replaced or whatever. But it's really important to have the data. This needs to be a data-driven approach. And it's very easy once you've got the data to identify the hotspots and work out where you can make the biggest impact.
Thanks, Tracy. Greg, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, so life cycle analysis is the starting place for this. And you can have levels of sophistication in that, from literally picking up the textbook yourself and working through a life cycle analysis for your products. There's a lot of work in that, and as Tracy says, the issue is getting the data rather than doing the manipulation on the spreadsheet, which is quite straightforward, a lot of adding and subtracting there. Through to a much more sophisticated process, and there is one company, at least one company, that's got a very sophisticated automated system where their designers say, look, I could design this formulation or this design of this particular product using different materials mixes. Let me put those into an automated spreadsheet, and in real time, that'll pop out as soon as you push return on entering a cell. That'll pop out what the greenhouse gas emissions are, the cost is, and other factors that they've included in there as well. So that's a really great tool if you've got a bunch of designers who just want something easy and you don't have infinite number of different input materials, which obviously is the cost in developing that. So that's the tools. Can I answer the first part of the question as well, which is which product? Taking a really pragmatic view, which we always do, an easy way to think about that is where are you really struggling to grow a product or even to sell a product? And that product might be the one that's most critically endangered right now and might be a good place with a burning platform where a new solution might be available, that you could really create a turnaround story that might lead to thinking in products that might be going just fine with nice big margins, and so everything's going well. Why would you change those? So a bit of thinking about sort of the overall dynamics of the portfolio is a place to start there.
Thanks, Greg. Tracy, I don't know if you want to respond. Someone just sent in another question around LCA. I mean, are you using that for manufacturing, just for manufacturing, or cradle to grave, including projected sales?
No, it is full life cycle, so it is cradle to grave. It's per product though, so per unit. So it doesn't take into account how many of that unit you expect to sell, only the per unit impact. One of the challenges of doing that is that obviously our product design is done in Japan. We're a Japanese-owned business. And if you look at the life cycle of a product in Japan, it will be different to the life cycle of the same product in another country, because the energy carbon profile will be different based on where you're consuming your energy during the use phase. The arrangements for end-of-life reprocessing will be different. The Japanese system is far more sophisticated than the UK system in terms of how we collect and process e-waste, for example. And so this is why we've ended up in a place where we're selling in the UK a product which is designed for disassembly, but which typically doesn't get disassembled because the recycling infrastructure here doesn't support it, whereas it was designed for a market where that happens as a matter of course. So, but it does take, you have to start somewhere. And so what we do is we assume Japanese life cycle and we design for the best infrastructure. And then we do the best we can to derive the end-of-life value from wherever the product happens to end up.
Great.
Yeah, another good tip around that is you start with the biggest impact. So, for example, we've just helped a very large aero engine manufacturer that make engines for planes. And the big issue they had was they were spending a lot of money on very high-value metals. So the life cycle analysis we concentrated on was for the highest value metals. And what we found for them is it was sort of consistent with opportunity number 2 that we described earlier. The opportunity for them was to reduce the amount and increase the amount of recycling of high value metals. And that was done through a life cycle analysis to see what the opportunity was and where that metal was going and what its footprint looked like through the cycle. So we focused on only a small part of the whole material mix and only on a couple of steps through the life cycle as well.
Thanks, Greg. So just one final question before we wrap up. Tracy, you mentioned about looking to increase the sharing of parts across the channels. How are you going about that?
We're just in the process of scoping it out currently, so we're not very well advanced with that. But it was interesting in that it was an output from a piece of TSB-funded research that we did with a couple of industrial designers, which was actually looking at a different issue. So the issue was how we could derive better value recycler from end-of-life products. But while investigating that, we discovered that there was another opportunity that we were missing to improve the sharing of parts. And I think, we take for granted a lot of the things that happen across our supply chain, and sometimes when you kind of unpick them, you find unexpected opportunities, and that was certainly one of those. So we've only just identified that there's an opportunity to do this better. So now we're talking to all our channel partners about what they currently do and what might be acceptable, and then we'll come up with a range of options that we'll evaluate to work out the best way forward.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. So that's all we've got time for now, but I'd like to thank Greg and Tracy for their time today and for getting through so many questions, and also for everyone who joined us in the webinar. Just to remind you all, a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be archived on the 2 Degrees platform. So I hope you found today interesting and useful, and that you'll be able to join us in the future for more webinars. Thank you.